Hey everybody, it's Derek here. Thanks as always for stopping by. So it's February 25th, which means it's still Black History Month when I'm filming this here right now. And there's a book that I want to talk about. I wanted to review that one. Let's get right into it. Okay everybody, so today we're talking about The Underground Railroad by William Still. There we go, that's a better image. As I mentioned towards the beginning of the month when I was laying out my to be read, I feel like this is just so familiar to me. I read it again, and there were a few of the stories that sort of jumped out at me. Like I've read this before. I think we talked a lot about this through school. I mean, this is a very big classic. I've got this. This was part of a box set called In Their Own Voices. It's first-hand slave accounts. Obviously through the antebellum era and around the Civil War. It was just approaching Black emancipation. And William Still, he was born to parents who were slaves. He was free, but he became a conductor for the Underground Railroad and, was in touch with many people, many slaves and families of slaves through the movement of abolition. And this book is mainly epistolary. You got lots of letter writing between various peoples trying to flee really horrible, brutal forms of slavery, generally from the South, and being secreted away in all manner of escape plots, like people being put in coffins or in boxes on horse carriages, or in steamers with no food or nothing like that, just the clothes on their back. I'll be honest, while I did rate this very high, I think I put this at 4 stars on Goodreads. The problem with it is I went through this very meticulously, but there's so many stories. I mean, there's a letter per page just about. And all of these people just sort of blend together. This particular book probably contains quite a percentage, I don't know what the percentage would be, but of those who actually found their freedom. Because through the abolition period, I think the abolitionists freed something. It wasn't very many. It's not as many as you'd think. I think a couple thousand, if I'm remembering correctly, from a book I read recently called Gateway to Freedom by Eric Foner, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. That's what I found so depressing, is that, for the millions of people toiling under this brutal regime, for literally just a handful of people to find their freedom is really dispiriting. That said, I mean, the abolitionists was an incredible movement, and it's not to take away from their efforts, but the fact is just it covers the tip of the iceberg of what was actually out there, and you've got, as I mentioned before, people being sold into slavery away from their families, people being kidnapped, such as in the case of Solomon Northup. I think actually Northup shows up in this book. At least that's the last name that turns up in this book. Also, people who left plantations, they left their whole family because they just thought, well, I'm gonna find my own freedom, and then I'll be in a much better position to bring people back through the Underground Railroad, which of course some were completely unsuccessful in that endeavor. So, they left their families, and it's like, well, where are you now? Yeah, you're not under the heat of the whip, but at the same time, you don't really have a life. I mean, your whole raison d'etre is taken away from you. And so many of these stories just kind of blend together, which is unfortunate because each one of these stories could stand on their own. What I love about this box set that the book was included in, you've got a handful of people there, like Booker T. Washington, who, granted, he did leave slavery very young. But Harriet Jacobs, who had been a slave for many years and was, secreted away in this little grotto or I think they call it a garret, with 3 feet high at the maximum, and just basically enough room to turn around. This was at the top of a barn. Somebody had constructed a little hatch. This terrible plantation owner who, there was sexual assault in the whole nine yards that she was fleeing from, and she had to be up there for 7 years, I think. And so why I'm mentioning this and people, like Solomon Northup and Frederick Douglass is you really get a sense turning through these pages that every last one of these people would have had a tale not dissimilar to that. Some were not quite as bad, but we are definitively talking about, varying degrees of terrible. So it's certainly not for the faint of heart, but I'm sure glad that this was included in that box set, because you really get a sense of, what the average slave would have contended with. And so for people to say things like, basically peddling in the lost cause myth, or the idealization that Confederates and Southern plantation descendants made it out to be, I would say most especially personified in Gone with the Wind. It's so out of touch with the reality of what slavery was. I have no doubt that there were some humane plantation owners, but for the most part, for the vast majority of it, it was horrible for just about everybody. In the North, you didn't have it quite as bad, but you were never truly free. Even if you got away to Canada, which was really the best bet, if you could get to Canada, you were home safe. Even still, I'm thinking of another book called The North Star. Came out just recently. I think it was just a few months ago, in 2023. And, it shows how there was a lot of racism in Canada, a lot of sympathy for Confederates. In fact, it wasn't just slaves that escaped Canada. It was Confederates too. So there was nowhere that was really safe. I don't think there was quite the same threat in, Toronto, for example, of being, caught by a slave catcher or being kidnapped. I'm sure there were, there was still some, but it probably wasn't anywhere near like New York. But still, what people went through just to basically flee the whip. These people didn't end up with a good life afterwards. You talk about traumas that people brought with them. People who, they had their children taken, sold into slavery right from under them. All they had was one name. So there's no way that you're ever going to track these people down. And many people just simply went mad. There was one story, I can't remember which book this was in, if it was in Underground Railroad or maybe it was in Harriet Jacobs' account, where she said like one lady just went mad and she couldn't speak for a month. She was so distraught, and she was never the same after. Her complete deportment changed from one of being relatively upbeat, even in the throes of slavery. But after her children were taken from her, she was never the same. She was just completely dejected, and had no reason for being. I know I'm being repetitive here, but not for the faint of heart. But man, you read this stuff and you'll never be the same person, and you'll never look at racial relations the same. I want to just make one brief note here as I am closing about that. One might say, we're a long ways away from slavery. A lot has changed, and indeed that is the case. But what strikes me is that slavery was not all that long ago. And, even situations that we take for granted, like the rights that were won during the civil rights era. Yeah, you got your voting rights, and you got broad participation in politics by Black people, and of course the end of segregation. But still, the realities continued on, even though, you have it on paper that there's no more structural racism in that same way. It's still carried on because culture doesn't change that fast. Not unless you really make a go of it, and you kind of model what Germany did following the end of the Nazi era. Unless you treat it like that, where we want to put this tradition of racism behind us. And there's still racism in Germany. I'm not saying that they're perfect, but I'm saying, They're leaps and bounds ahead of America. The fact that there is a bit of a time gap there, that's almost meaningless, because that has only ever been accomplished by holding public officials to account and keeping that pressure consistent. And the moment you let up the pressure, you're going to backslide. This is actually what happened after Obama. Everybody says, see how much further we are ahead. We've even got a black president now. And yet you look at the actual realities. A lot of black people lost a whole lot of rights in the post-Obama era because it simply didn't reflect the reality. And it actually serves as a perfect cover for the other side to place a lot of constraints on black people. The incarceration problem got worse. In some ways it is improving now, finally. But, in virtually every area of study, you're talking about police brutality, you're talking about, the loss of voting rights, how blacks are targeted by the legal system. Even little things like, well, not so little for them, but things that we don't tend to think about. Like they've even analyzed how many black appeals win relative to white appeals, and the numbers are so disparate. Again, coming back to my main point here, slavery may seem like it's been a long ways away. It's long in the past. We're not going back. But just as it was a gradual process leaving slavery and leaving Jim Crow, it's a gradual process back. And that's going to be the case unless everybody signs on to post-racialism or being anti-racist or, whatever movement you want to espouse. I think racial relations will never be perfect, but, you better keep working at it, because if you don't, it's going to backslide. And we've seen evidence for that all the way along through Black emancipation. So this has been incredibly valuable for me to read. If you want to know just how horrible humans can be to one another, things can revert back to this mighty swiftly. Just to put something into perspective, think of it like this. The year is 2046. That's 22 years from now, okay? Counting from the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, there will have passed roughly half as many years since the end of slavery as the lifespan of the transatlantic slave trade itself. Put differently, the year will be 2229, counting since emancipation, as slavery existed in the states overall. Bear in mind, counting from emancipation is totally arbitrary, because slavery still continued for years afterward, with convict leasing and sharecropping and that sort of thing, and technically still exists with mass incarceration and how the 13th Amendment oppresses black people in private or for-profit prisons. Now that sounds horribly bleak, but only because it is. Don't be deluded with progress bias. The more things change, the more things remain the same. Things have indeed gotten better, sure, but I hope I've argued my point, or at least offered an interesting perspective here. And so maybe on that note, I'll leave it there. Let me know in the comments if you guys have read this book. I would love to hear your input on it, and or if you're about to read it, I would love to hear from you too. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you in the next one. Hey everyone, I hope you liked this video. If you want more like the one you just watched, click the suggested video on this screen. Make sure you subscribe, and to connect with me on my other platforms, my handles are linked below in the description, alright? Take care, peeps. Till next time.